Well, good evening, everyone. I'd like to just take this opportunity to thank the Board of Education for allowing us to present to you this evening. So this kicks off our budget presentation process. It's our first budget presentation meeting. We're going to be covering the non-instructional operational components of the school budget. On March 15th, we're going to be covering personnel and human resources and employee benefits. And on March 29th, we're going to be covering the instructional budgets. And finally, the budget presentation process will conclude with the superintendent's budget recommendation on April 12th. So with me this evening is Dr. Bhargav Vyas, Assistant Superintendent for Compliance and Information Systems, Ms. Dawn Russell, our Transportation Director, Mr. Andre Rudiak, our Director of Facilities, and Mr. Joseph Trapoto, our Director for Safety and Security. So we're going to cover essentially their respective areas of the budget. And before we do that, I'd like to provide sort of the big picture budget presentation, some of the things that are impacting the budget. We like to cover state aid and the tax cap, and then get into the individual operational areas. So this is very much what I just said. It's sort of like the agenda for the evening. We're going to do the budget overview, the tax cap, state aid. Then we're going to cover buildings and grounds, safety and security, central printing, data processing, computer-assisted instruction, library, media, and transportation. And actually, before we get started, I just want to take a moment and thank my secretary, Kathy Fico, for all her assistance in putting the budget together. I'd also like to thank all the business office staff, some of which are here tonight, that helped us get to this point. So we're not done, really. This is sort of, I would say, the halfway point in the budget development process, but all that staff has been really instrumental in getting us here. Okay. 35%. What happened, Mario? Bear with us for a moment. We're having a little technical difficulty. Okay. Back in business.
Oh, but it's not.
For the time being.
It's not up on the TV in front of us.
Give us
Okay.
2 seconds, Patrick, because we can't see the screen.
Okay. It's okay behind you.
Front.
That's a nice way of saying turn around.
That's what I thought it said, right? Just turn around, I'll see. Move your head.
The big screen is okay. The little one, I guess not.
It showed up for a second and then disappeared.
It's just rude to give your backs to people.
That's always the fickle part of this system, right? The TV.
Good. How have you been? Dan was good?
I got in trouble as a kid, and I did often.
Yeah. I do have a hard copy.
I like to look at it on
I'm just
TV.
letting you know there's a hard copy. This looks like
Let's try to make it work the way it's supposed to.
it's true.
It's okay.
We could just turn it.
We have, it's okay. Now that looks like a horror movie. Is that a horror movie where you go into
The Ring.
The Ring, right?
I know my horror movies.
Me too.
Yeah.
Yes, I am a big horror movie person.
Oh, we gotta talk.
Yeah, this is The Ring. We're all gonna go into this dark.
So why don't we have Mr. Cahill just move forward that way, because
Yeah.
so you have
Yeah,
time.
the audience can see this, and you folks have the handout, so
We'll
move
just turn to make sure we're on the right page.
There you go. Okay, so we covered the agenda for this evening. Let's get right into it. So, as I said previously, I like to sort of do a big budget overview, talk about some of the challenges, some of the developments in the budget, some of the things that are impacting our budget for the upcoming year, and obviously we're talking about the 23-24 general fund budget. So inflationary pressures continue. We talked about this last year at this time. Unfortunately, generally economists, a lot of people thought the inflation would abate. It has not happened. There's several areas within the budget presentation where we're using a CPI factor, and a lot of times that's about 8%, so that fluctuates. But it's continuing to impact our budget. Our projections for next year would be for increases in materials and supplies, commodities. You'll see that over the course of the presentation, particularly with utilities. The oil and natural gas is up, and we're seeing, pressure, inflationary pressure in services as well, particularly the construction trades. Contract transportation, similar conversation last year at this time, continued growth in that area of the budget. We're projecting both growth in the price, so I talk about that, the cost per unit, if you will, and that's adjusted by a CPA factor that we're projecting, and growth in the enrollment area. So it's approximately 15% projected growth in enrollment. So the quantity that we buy is increasing, and the actual price of the transportation is increasing as well. Health insurance premium increase of about 4.5%. So initially, the plan was requesting about a 7% increase. We were able to knock that down to 4.5%. Just to put it in perspective, NYSHIP, which is another major health plan, that's the health plan that's used by the state and also local governments and other school districts, they're projecting an increase around 12.5% for individual and 15% for families. So the OU health plan, which we're a part of, the consortium of 20 districts, is doing a really good job with cost containment. And in fact, we're not diminishing benefits in a lot of cases, we're enhancing the benefits. But again, to give you an idea, I like to put the individual premium amounts on there. So for next year, the individual premium is $13,800. The two-person, so this, you remember last year, the health plan went to a three-tier system. Two-person is $29,892, and the family plan is $33,768. So expensive benefit that we provide to people, and it's one of those things. Health services inflation is growing everywhere, and we're not immune to that, nor is our health plan. OU BOCES capital projects, so we've talked a lot about that. It's impacting next year's budget. The actual amount is $940,000. We were talking about being over $1 million, so based on the way they're rolling that out, it's a little bit less than that. But it's close to $1 million impact on our budget impact. The ERS, employer contribution rate. So ERS, it's the local and state employee retirement system. That's the system that non-certificated employees are a part of. So basically that's, all those that are not instructional, not teachers, et cetera. So we're seeing a rate increase from about 13% to 15% for next year, and that would equate to a little over $700,000 budget-to-budget increase for us. Fortunately, TRS, their rates are flat, but there is a slight increase based on the growth in the payroll. So it's two factors, right? If your payroll grows and the rate is the same, you're still going to pay more. So, in the case of ERS, it's a rate increase and growth in payroll, so it's a little bit, it's higher for sure. So the good news in the budget, the state aid changes. So this is the final year for the foundation aid phase-ins. We've talked a lot about that. It's a 3-year phase-in. Governor Hochul has supported that and continued that. So we're seeing an increase in our state aid for 23-24. And I have, a little caveat there, but what about next year, right? And so the last 2 years, we've had, based on inflationary pressures and some of the other things we're going to talk about tonight, some budget increases that were covered by this increase in state aid. But the idea is, what are we going to do when the phase-in, which will be next year, is over? And we can't expect that sort of relatively large increase in state aid. So, we continue to look for ways to cost contain within the district and ways to, I like to say, maximize our return on investment. Final bullet, expiring contract with the MWTA, so that's the teachers and the teaching assistants. So, I have high confidence that we'll have a contract settled by the end of the year, but it creates some uncertainty this time of year because the contract is not settled as far as, the budget, and a little bit of risk. It is what it is, though. So I just wanted to throw this slide up here. Now, this is an estimate of the budgetary cost drivers in next year's budget. So these are things, some of which are fairly solid, others are still in flux. But overall, I would say this is an estimate. The budget is by no means finished at this point. We still have some work to do. And I won't go through everything, but I'll just start out the first two rows here. UPK, GF is general fund, portion, 400,000, guidance and psychology, or I'm sorry, psychologist salaries, 463,000. So those are expenses in the budget which we're covering with ARPA money, the federal money that we've been receiving. And so we heard a lot about the fiscal cliff that everyone would be facing. And so we're shifting some of those expenses back into our general fund budget. So those are, the first couple of items on there. The tutoring set aside, I'm going to talk more about that. That has to do with a portion of our foundation aid increase, which we're going to really get into in a moment. I know everyone's really looking forward to that. But there's a portion, a carve-out of the ordinary increase in foundation aid that we're supposed to be using for, they call it high-impact tutoring. So it's one-on-one tutoring with students in grades 3 through 8. And there's not a lot of details. There's some details. But it's a little unusual because foundation aid is general aid, and normally strings are not attached to it, like this. When you prescribe how money has to be used, it's more like a grant program. You have a specific use for it, or it's like an expenditure-based aid that we will talk about in a minute too. So foundation aid is not like that. It's supposed to be free and clear state aid, general aid, and unfortunately they're taking a portion of it and they're saying you must do these things with it. And perhaps the most important element of this is that they're saying it must supplement, not supplant. And what that means is it has to be in addition to what you already do. You cannot take something you're already doing and just saying, we're going to cover that with this tutoring set aside. It's supposed to be something that is new. There's a little bit of, I think flexibility there, because there could be things that you wouldn't have ordinarily done. But it's something that we're watching, and it's something new, and it's something to be a bit concerned about. Ordinary salary increases about $3 million. I talked about TRS, we talked about ERS. FICA is the Social Security and Medicare, it's payroll taxes, so that is 7.65%. Health insurance, about $1.3 million increase. The BOCES capital project we touched on. The bus purchase transfer to capital. So unlike other years, not last year, we're not proposing a proposition for buses separately. What we're proposing is to include that in the general fund budget. And so when the voters approve the general fund budget, they've approved the bus purchase. And we do that with a transfer to the capital fund, and that's actually how we buy buses, because it's a capital expenditure. That's how we do capital projects. So that's what that 1.5 million is. The contract transportation, Ms. Russell will talk about, we've touched on it, and then the buildings and grounds utility increases. So overall, that's a $13.6 million increase in terms of the things that are driving the budget higher potentially for next year. So let's talk about the tax cap for a couple of minutes. So the MW 2% tax cap for next year. I can go through all the steps. Maybe I'll just touch on some of the highlights instead of going through all the steps. So the basic formula, it's a multi-step process, it's about 8 steps, and it's basically a limit on the growth in property taxes or the tax levy, right, for local governments in New York State. So it's not just applicable to us, it's applicable to county, town, village. You can override, in other words, if you need to override the cap, you can do that with more than 60%. In the case of a school district, voters approving that. There are some exclusions or exceptions to the cap. So those would be like capital expenses. There are certain rare exclusions if there's like really large expenses that are out of your control. Some of those are excludable. But the basic premise is we take last year's levy, which would be this year's levy. We apply a growth factor, the tax-based growth factor, which has to do with the change in the tax base, basically, brick and mortar kind of construction, new construction in the community. We add prior year pilots, which are payments in lieu of taxes. It's a form of, a substitute for taxes, property taxes. We deduct the prior year exemptions. Those are the exclusions I mentioned. We have an adjusted prior year levy, and then we apply the allowable growth factor. And so this is really the major rule in the tax cap calculation. It's the lesser of 2% or CPI. And so we've talked about this as a potential problem with the formula, because if inflation is high, which it now is, and it has not really been high for the last 10 or 12 years when this has been in effect, you're limited to a 2% increase when the prices of everything may be at 8%, and they are. The CPI that was used to reach the 2% was, I think, 7.9%. So for a prolonged period, this could be a real problem with this formula. In other words, the cost of everything is going up at 8%, and you're limited to revenue increase, tax increase of 2%. So we're at 1.02, 2%. We then deduct the coming year pilots. We have our tax levy limit. We add in our upcoming year exemptions or exclusions, which are mostly debt service minus any building aid, because it's mostly for capital expenditures. And we have our maximum allowable levy. And so it equates to 3.6 million or 2.8%, very close to what the allowable increase was for the current year, last year. And I just want to point out again that although the levy limit for us last year was 2.77%, we levied at 1.95%. So I think that was the third year in a row we've been below the tax cap. So I just wanted to kind of shift to the executive budget proposal for P12. So this is Governor Hochul's proposal. It's not law yet, but I think, unlike other years, this will largely probably, go in as is. The state aid will be, what she has proposed. The most notable thing here really is the first bullet provides for a $3.1 billion, 10% increase in state aid. And most of that is foundation aid. 2.7 billion of that increase is for the increase in foundation aid. So that phase-in, that final third year of the phase-in. Other expenditure-based aids are largely intact. So we've talked about the expenditure-based aids that we utilize, other districts do. A lot of the aid comes from spending money in this year and then receiving aid, almost like a reimbursement in the following year. So let's see, I mentioned the new foundation aid set aside for high-impact tutoring. So again, it's about 1.67 million for us, and we're watching that closely, but that's a new thing with the governor's proposal. The governor's proposal adds 125 million to expand pre-K programs, and there's also a reporting requirement, which would be dealing with the pre-K counts, both that we're serving and that we could be serving in the community. I've heard people opine that it will kind of shine a light on unmet needs potentially in the community, and sometimes the state does that. They make you report on something because they want to, point it out or draw attention to it. The next bullet, zero-emission bus mandate reporting, that's similar to what I was just talking about, where we now, if you recall, last year's budget, 2027, all new bus purchases have to be zero-emission, essentially electric. By 2035, the entire fleet and all the contractors that we use have to be fully electric. So next year, they'll be making us report out on our progress. So, cynically, you could say, well, it's sort of one of those name and shame things. They want to see how you're doing, but I think they also want to know what kind of progress is being made and if 2027 and 2035 are realistic, if they're even going to be close to being realistic as far as a deadline. But the kind of things we have to report on have to do with the electrical grid, the health of the grid, right? We were talking about that, Dawn. How we're going to have that information, I don't know. We're going to have to reach out to our utility companies. The number of buses we've purchased, our anticipated purchases, how our contractors are doing, what kind of training we've provided to employees, what kind of charging stations we've installed. So it's this whole gamut of things we're going to have to report out on. I'm going to just skip over the next couple. Flexibility with the interchangeableness of the instructional materials aid. So a few years ago, textbook aid, software, hardware, library materials aid, there's a prescribed limit to how much you can receive, and they changed the law so you could kind of reallocate those between those categories. So that's going to continue. 5-year extension of the school funding transparency initiative. So that is a reporting requirement that most agencies, ASBO, New York State Association of School Business Officials, think state school boards, they kind of said, really, this is unnecessary. It's like an unfunded mandate. It's something you're requiring districts to do, and nobody's using the information or looking at it really, as far as I know. Why are we continuing it? And it was set to sunset in this year, so they've done a 5-year extension on that. And then finally, the retiree income waiver. So typically, there's a limit on what retirees can earn when working for a public entity, so it's $35,000. So they waive that through this year. It was going to be June 30th, 2023. That waiver would end, and they've extended it for another year. So that's all part of the executive budget proposal. Helps us with, right, recruiting staff. There's been labor shortages in different areas, so that was the idea of that. Any questions? Okay, so this is a flow chart that provides a schematic about how foundation aid works, the foundation aid formula. And mercifully, I will not go through every box and line of this grid, but what I wanted to do is I wanted to put some actual numbers for our district onto this schematic so we can see how our foundation aid was calculated, roughly, broadly speaking. And what I've done over here is I'm actually just showing, the math, the steps in the math, and I've put some of these numbers actually on this schematic. So broadly speaking, the way foundation aid works is there's an amount of money, and I'm calling it up here in the upper left-hand corner, selected foundation aid per pupil. And that's supposed to be an amount to provide a sound basic education for a student, multiplied by the number of students a district has. So that's sort of the most basic formula, to cook it down, distill this. Now, of course, the foundation aid per pupil is impacted by a number of factors, right? So it's adjusted. And so is the enrollment adjusted by a number of factors. So I'm just going to walk through a couple of the factors. So I'm going to begin over here with this amount, which is called the foundation aid amount. So it's the base amount that the state uses with districts to provide a sound basic education. It's $7,242. It's then adjusted by the consumer price index. So this year, it's 1.079. It's 8% basically. So that helps us with our foundation aid. It accounts for why our foundation aid went up in some ways. And from there, we have $7,814, so that's the adjusted foundation aid amount. And then we multiply this by these two factors. So the first factor, pupil needs index, so that takes into account the composition of your students. If you have poverty in your community, you have more English language learners. We can actually trace this down all the way to the bottom here, the lower left-hand corner, where we see this box is 2000 census poverty. So that's a measure of the poverty in the community. We've talked about, it's actually using census information from the year 2000. So that's one of those things that we've talked about. What happens if they update that? Why haven't they updated it? Because it might send a shockwave through this formula. But they use the English language learners as a factor and a variable. They use 3-year average FRIPL, free and reduced price lunch. And we often talk about that as being a factor in state aid. And then a sparsity count. So the sparsity count just has to do with, is it a rural community? They tend to have greater needs. So we roll all of this up, and we see for Monroe-Woodbury, our pupil needs index is 1.32. So we multiply this amount by 1.32. We next deal with a regional cost index. So for us, we tend to be in a slightly higher cost of living area, and 1 would sort of be the state average in most of these things. So we're at 1.314, and we get 13,553. So that is our adjusted foundation aid amount. We then deduct our local share, and the state has 2 ways to compute local share. The first method here is just $8,102, and then the alternative method, and you see here this says lesser of, so it's the smaller number, and this is where we fit in. We're one of 4 districts in the whole state that this other method was more beneficial to us, so why, I don't know. But you basically, this is 1 minus the foundation aid state sharing ratio, that's what FASSR stands for. But what it comes down to, I'll just cut to the chase here, that our local deduction is $6,126. And we deduct that from the $13,553, and so our foundation aid amount is $7,427. So this amount is then up here, and then we multiply that by our total aidable foundation pupil units, and you see down here in the lower right-hand corner, we get $60,657,534 approximately. That is our foundation aid amount for next year. So there, you can go down any number of rabbit holes on this formula, but what I wanted you to see is the complexity of the formula. All these ratios and things have many, many inputs and factors, but we can see at a broad level, at a high level, how we got that number. Any questions?
You were very thorough.
Okay, all right. So I didn't want to blow everybody's mind, but I thought it was important to see how this formula works roughly, broadly. Okay, so this is our state aid run. So we've looked at these before. It's organized by county, and they give you a report for the entire state, and the way the report is organized is they show the current year on top, and then the projection for next year on the bottom here. And what's notable is you see this increase in foundation aid. So we went from the current year, which is actually different than what they said we would be getting this year, last year, $45,076,000 approximately, to $60,657,000. And if we go back, we can see down in the lower right-hand corner, that's our foundation aid amount computed and calculated. And then at the bottom of this state aid report, we can see the high-impact tutoring set aside. It's $1,674,000. So that's our state aid run. And the other thing I like to point out, I'm going to move ahead here. So here is our state aid for next year budget and our current year budget in state aid. And you can see here's the foundation aid. We talked about that increase. And one thing I would point out is you see this number, we budgeted $44.9 million because last year at this time, that's what they said we would get in foundation aid. But you see, if we go back, we're actually getting more. So there can be variations in the pupil counts, even little changes in some of those ratios that would affect the number. So foundation aid is the one state aid number that is probably, well, it's not there's one more that is not going to change. These other expenditure-based aids are estimates, really, and they're estimates based on what we thought we would spend in the current year at the beginning of the year. So in the summer, we made estimates. And so the BOCES aid, high-cost private excess cost aid, these are for special needs students. Those are based on an estimate with a state formula. But hardware, software, library, these are not really changing much. Transportation's expenditure-based aid. This is the one form of aid, the high tax aid, which has not changed in, probably 10 or 12 years. The building aid is based on, what we think we're doing with capital projects. We're not doing much. Notice that this has fallen, and the building aid is frequently aligned to your debt service, right? So the idea is as you pay off your capital projects, you're receiving building aid, and this is one of those things where when we talked about the capital referendum, we're trying to line it up just right. So this is something we'd want to watch, that our building aid over time would start to decrease because we're paying off some of that debt service. And in the final line here, I have an MW state aid adjustment. It's $2.5 million. So we slightly higher than what we did, for the current year, last year at this time. It has to do with, like I said, some of the uncertainty associated with the expenditure-based aids, but also that high-impact tutoring set-aside, that $1.6 million. We're not really sure where that's going to go, if it's going to be a big deal, or it has the potential to hold back some of our aid. So we made that adjustment, to make sure we're covered and we're playing it safe and being conservative here. So the budget-to-budget change for our projected state aid is an increase of $14.6 million or 21.8%. And so this is the budget triangle, which represents a balanced budget, which by law we must have. And it's just a graphical representation of how our revenue and our appropriations must be equal, and how, based on our revenue and what we spend our money on, we have our instructional program at the base of the triangle. So right here, we're showing our state aid revenue. We just looked at that slide, 81.5 million. We're projecting our miscellaneous revenue, approximately 2.2 million. So the miscellaneous is, services that we provide and we charge other districts for, sale of surplus equipment, et cetera. And then what I did is I put the current year tax levy in here, $129,074,000 approximately, giving us a total revenue budget of $212,855,030. And so if we just bring this across the revenue budget and compare it to the current year budget, the appropriations side, that represents $11,330,000 increase approximately, or a 5.6% increase. So again, we're not done with the budget. The state aid is not final. The appropriation side is not final. But this is sort of the big picture of where things stand right now, mostly looking at the state aid and the revenue side of the picture. And then finally, what I wanted to do is just take a minute to go through the budget code structure that we use. When you look at some of the reports, there's a standard format for budget codes in New York State for school districts, and there's four components to it. The first is the function code. It has 4 positions. The next is an object code with 3, a location code, and a program code. So function codes, these are the same. It's a chart of accounts in New York State among school districts. So buildings and grounds is 1620. We're going to hear about that in a minute. Safety security is 1622, and so on. Teaching is a big one, 2110. Anything with a 2 is instructional in nature. And then finally, transportation begins with a 55 really, and we're going to look at 3 function codes here. Object codes, anything that begins with a 1 is salary or payroll. Equipment is 201, and so on. BOCES 490. And then location codes are specific to the district. So from Monroe Woodbury, 01 is the high school, 02 is the middle school, and so forth. And finally, the program code, the last 4 digits of your budget code are also specific to the school district. And they give us the ability to, let's say, do a query, and we could put 4200 in for the program code, and we could see everything associated with the math program throughout the district based on that program code. So any questions?
Quick question. So the increase in state aid is driven by the inflation, the number of students we're getting, or the change in need of the students?
Well, it is driven by the foundation aid program by inflation. You saw that one factor, but it's also driven by the idea that formula was being phased in, like fully phased in over 3 years. So, like prior to 3 years ago, that formula was in existence, but the state basically, they couldn't afford to run that formula and pay districts the money they were owed. So we phased that in, and so for next year will be this final year, that is fully phased in, and all the factors that go into that parts like the regional cost index, the student need index, all those things would factor into the increase that we're going to be receiving.
So it's phasing in. It's not necessarily that we have proportionally more students that are in need or a larger number. I'm just trying to assess the stress level on the school district.
I think both things are happening, but I think the phase-in is proportionally much more important in the increase, if that makes sense. I think some of those other factors, the 2000 census poverty, that's not changing. But the free and reduced price lunch, the FRIPPLE factor, that is changing, that is increasing, we know that. I think our E&L population, that is changing, that is increasing. So there are district-specific factors which are driving it higher, but I think I understand your question, sir. I think the bigger piece, the overriding piece, is the idea of just letting the formula run the way it's supposed to, and it is accounting for that big increase.
Has the state indicated when they would be looking at that census data that's 23 years old?
I've been in some meetings, Michael, where they have talked about updating that, and I think, and I'm sure they have done it. It would be very easy, I think, to just go in and say, let's just plug in some new numbers. And I think state aid decisions are always political. You know, we used to show that part of it would be, okay, upstate New York gets, you know, they normally get 12%, so they're going to get 12.5, and Long Island gets this much, and they need to get that much. So they, for years, decades probably, the decisions about the formulas were driven by politics and things like that. I think this sort of falls into that category. It might have, you know, I don't think it would be that big of a factor, but create shifts that would be, you know, difficult to explain. I mean, the one thing that is part of this formula is everyone is held harmless. So when you run this formula, there's districts that should get less foundation aid, but they held it so nobody would. Everyone got a minimum of 3% increase. So, you know, that's part of the political component of it. You got a formula, it's more equitable, it has better adequacy for foundation, or for state aid. That's what it's supposed to be. State aid is supposed to be equalizing, right? Districts with greater need get more, with less need get less. So even that, you know, they compromise by saying everybody, no one gets less, and in fact, everybody gets 3% more minimum. So I don't know. I've been in meetings with the director of the analysis and research unit at SED that looks at these things, and they didn't give us a real clear answer about why they haven't made that change. I think it's the idea of what it would do and how it would shake that up.
Okay.
Maybe is unpalatable.
Sounds like it. Are there any other questions?
Okay, so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Andre Rudak, who's going to walk us through the buildings and grounds budget.